Welcome to Podcash, the portable professional development podcast from CASH alumni. CASH alumni is the fastest growing association of professionals in care, health, and education, and we're happy to have you here. This is where you'll hear from specialists and experts from across our network. Here's what's coming up.
Should we be seeing students at the moment copy and pasting an extended response question, an ERQ from their assessment into a generative AI, copy and pasting the answer back into an assessment paper and submitting it? No, we absolutely shouldn't. Clearly, that's not right. It's not testing anything. So we need to change our assessment. We need to respond to what AI is presenting us as an opportunity and say, well, we need to change how we assess that then.
Let's jump in to this week's episode.
I am James Lay. I'm the Digital Sector Manager here at NCFE. And today we're talking about artificial intelligence, its involvement here at NCFE, and perhaps the wider reach. I've been with NCFE for about 4 years, and I come from the digital sector. So I've been exposed to this for around about 2 decades as the sector, and I've seen it grow. I'm really excited to talk today with Gray about what it's doing at NCFE. Gray.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Gray. I work in the Innovation Team at NCFE. One of my roles is to lead on all things AI at NCFE, how we can use it, how we can advise learners and customers on AI use in our assessments.
So I've just mentioned there, obviously, that it's evolved over quite a long period of time, but it's become particularly popular, I think, in the last few years. What I think is a really interesting and exciting place to start is, what have you seen within NCFE, and perhaps how are you seeing it evolve? What are people doing with it at the moment?
Okay, so we recently asked our colleagues how they're using AI, or if they're using AI and how. And those that are using AI are in the main using generative AI to create some text for them for lots of different reasons and purposes. They're mainly using those kind of free generative AI services, so like ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude and all the others. And like I say, they're mainly sort of doing fairly routine, basic tasks. So they might be trying to create a bit of content, or they might be trying to edit a bit of text they've written, brush up an email, to polish up an email, make it sound better, make it sound more concise. All the regular things that people are using Gen AI for at that fundamental transactional level. So essentially, I want to do a task. I'm going to see if Gen AI can do it for me, or at least do the first bit. Or I've done a task, I've created some text, I want to see if Gen AI can maybe make it better or edit it. That's by far the most use. I find interesting is some of my colleagues reporting using generative AI in a much more conversational way. So rather than just that kind of transaction where you say, I want a thing, please do this. Some colleagues are using it to chat about an idea or to develop their thought process, to maybe brainstorm with their generative AI tool. I saw one of my colleagues was talking about using their generative AI tool to kind of capture their work conversations and then just look for those patterns and look for links and sort of putting 2 and 2 together at the end of a working week to really try and maximize their use of it. So that for me is a really sort of good developmental point. If you're using generative AI on that kind of transactional basis at the moment, I want a thing, please produce it for me, or I've done a thing, please edit it for me, then maybe sort of the next step could be this more like conversational approach where you start really working with your AI assistant rather than it kind of just doing stuff for you, like on a one-off basis.
I'm really interested in for the relationship between the AI profile or potentially even an avatar. So are you seeing people actually having that conversational style as if it were an actual entity? So having this sort of, you mentioned brainstorming. So are we seeing people say things like, is this a good idea? And then taking input rather than quite a clinical, cold and sterile environment, which is essentially throwing some data at it and it coming back and saying, here's the answer. And you go, fantastic, we'll move on. So is that relationship style developing as well?
Yeah, I definitely in fairly sort of small numbers at the moment. So I guess I'm talking about people that I would call sort of almost expert users of generative AI who have kind of done what we've all done and but moved on from that kind of basic just asking asking a question and much more having that conversation. It's things like it's not necessarily, is this a good or a bad idea? I don't know what you found, James, but I found that generative AI doesn't really like giving too much of an opinion. It tries to be really balanced in everything. And, in that way, it's not human at all. But having, for example, you can say, I've got these ideas. These are why I think they're good. Can you spot any flaws in my argument? So you're kind of using it. You're not trying to get an answer saying, this is what I should do. I should go down this path. But you're trying to ask it, is your justification sound, essentially, or does it need some work? Or does your thought process need to work because you can't justify your decision that you've made or something like that?
Okay, so it's useful to have that sounding board. And I love the idea that you're sort of throwing out some ideas and kind of saying, have I missed anything? Almost to the you seeing a pattern that other people are spotting, perhaps. You just mentioned something right at the beginning, that people are using it and they're mostly using the free tiers or free versions or free models. Any insight as to why that is? Is it just because it eliminates that risk around cost, or is there something more to that?
I think most people are using ChatGPT free version. That's the kind of, the majority for sure are using that. Again, it's a bit of a journey, I think, isn't it? So if that's your really easily accessible starting point, it's free and it works. And we all know, even if you haven't used it before, the interface is simple enough that you can get going with it. And then I think people are going on a journey to branch out to say, okay, well, I've used that. Now I've understood the kind of things it can do, but maybe there is a better thing for me because, for example, maybe it's not the best at creating images and my job is around images or video or something. Or maybe it's not the best at this particular skill set. I don't know if you've seen the sort of comparison tables, but you often get these comparisons between the LLMs, and it sort of says that, this LLM has been marked at this level for reasoning, this level for language, this level for sort of maths, and so on. And so you can definitely gravitate towards other things like a Claude or like Gemini. And again, probably start with the free service because it's sort of an experimental thing, and then work your way up, I guess, if you want to.
Absolutely. I think there's two evolution paths that I've been really interested in. I know that sounds a little bit nerdy, but bear with me. The evolution of the prompt. And I think you wonderfully highlighted that something like ChatGPT is very accessible because it's simplistic, or probably more accurate, say familiar in its modeling. So if you can use a search engine, you can use a ChatGPT. But of course, what we do know, both from a search engine and a AI prompt perspective, is it's what you put into it will influence what you get out of it. And so it's really interesting here, chatting to people about that and hearing them sort of say, well, actually, what I've discovered is if I type this, this, and this in, then it gives a more accurate answer, a more useful answer, a more something answer. And you're going to go, wow, you've accidentally stumbled upon prompt efficacy. And you don't know that you've done it, which is brilliant. And I find that really interesting and really exciting to hear that people are sort of discovering for themselves. And I think it would be absolutely brilliant if NCFE, or when NCFE is able to come out and say, look, this is the tool, this is what we're going to give you, et cetera, et cetera. But hearing people use it themselves more specifically and not wait for that, I think is amazing. And the other thing is hearing the tools that people use and sort of maybe that they're using AI and they don't realize that they're using AI. Grammarly is one example that I use. I think a lot of people do use it. And there's a significant number of people who perhaps didn't realize that there was any AI component to that at all, because it's perhaps just been an issue with their marketing, that it's just a spell check kind of thing and it's just corrects your grammar. But they're taking those inputs, they're taking those suggestions, and they don't appreciate where they're coming from. And I wonder whether that's maybe like a sideways entry for AI into the every person's life. They're not seeing it coming. They perhaps are using smart speakers, they're using technology at home, and they don't appreciate that there's an AI component. And I get quite excited about that, but I wonder if it may catch people off guard at work.
Yeah, I guess it's probably going to get more with the introduction of Copilot as and when that comes in. So there'll be potential to use an AI to help with a job within your Word or within your Excel or within your PowerPoint or within whatever application you're using. And so that kind of using AI without knowing you're using AI is even more, I guess, likely to happen. I mean, I don't know whether that's a problem or not. I guess it depends on where some of your moral stances around using AI. Particularly, I know people have understandably an issue with, for example, how these things have been trained and whether they've been, whether they've kind of just harvested all this data from the internet, and no one's given permission to say you can use the bit that I wrote of the internet, you can use if you like in your training, and practically obviously very hard to get permission. And so that's a problem, as is the issue of, maybe the next level up of kind of actually copyrighted or intellectual property sort of protected work and data that are more than likely ended up in the training data. And I think the third moral issue that people have is around the transparency, of even just knowing what's in the training library, what has been used, understanding it, knowing what kind of, being maybe more upfront about the fact that this absolutely will be biased. By the way, this training material, that the internet is mostly written by people like you and I, James, middle-aged, middle-class white men, and so we have an absolute bias to kind of to the world that we've been exposed to. I would rather people did know they're using AI rather than it kind of coming in, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be happy to choose to use it. I was going to ask you, if it's all right, I've never used Grammarly before. Can you sort of talk through what Grammarly can do that maybe I couldn't get from my ChatGPT 4.0 engine? Is there a difference in its capabilities?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm the right person, maybe make a comparison, but Grammarly's focus is quite narrow in that regard. It's really, it's covering SPAG in that sort of high level sense, but it's the suggestion is where the AI comes in. So in its original iteration, it was just kind of looking at grammar and saying, you've used the wrong there, and you probably meant this. And you go, great, okay, it's just like a little professional aid. Then it's kind of looking at summaries and say, well, it looks like you're trying to write a professional email, but you've written it in this way. Do you want to perhaps try this paragraph structure instead? Which, now I say that aloud, makes it sound a little bit like Clippy from Microsoft Word, where it looks like you're trying to write a CV. I suppose in essence it is, but it's sourcing that data. So it kind of touches back on that point you just made, where it's like, where's the data for AI come from? Is it coming from that large model? Has it sourced it from somewhere? Is generative AI ever truly generative? Is it creating anything, or is it only curating what's already existing? And I think that model probably, and I appreciate this is a huge sweeping statement, but that model probably works wonderfully when it comes to things like grammar and sentence structure, because we can see that model and how it evolves in English, and I suppose some of it's opinionated how it should or shouldn't be written. But when you apply that generative AI, when you apply that to a creative model, you're sort of taking someone else's work, but there's a subjective element to it. So if you're creating art or any kind of imagery, then you're asking it to do something in a postmodernist style. Well, it can't know what that is. It can only know what has happened. So just to kind of tie up the Grammarly side, I don't know whether it necessarily does anything that other models don't do. I would imagine not, but it's just a useful tool to have. And I suspect what we're going to end up with is we'll all use multiple tools. I don't see one consolidated tool. I don't see how that could happen, or perhaps whether it should happen. What we've seen certainly in the evolution of technology, big sweeping statement here, but where a monopoly exists, generally that doesn't lead to good things within the tech sector, and probably not for any sector, to be perfectly honest. We need the competition. We need the evolution and the innovation to drive forward. So I'm quite happy with my Grammarly, and quite happy with ChatGPT, and quite happy with Gemini. They all do slightly different things, some better than others. Sometimes it just comes down to UI. Which one do I fancy looking at for the next hour? But more importantly, perhaps, like how much do I trust the result? And I think that touches on maybe some of the moral elements that you were just touching on as well. I think the worry that I sometimes have when people are using AI to get definitive answers is the answer isn't always definitive. It's pattern repeating. So, or maybe not even that actually, but it's just sort of saying, well, look, this is what a lot of people do. Therefore, I've drawn my conclusion. But when you submit a query, and recently I saw an example where people were asking AI how many R's there are in strawberry. And that text string doesn't actually get passed to an AI. It tokenizes the words. And so it sort of understands the question based on the component parts, but it doesn't necessarily understand what you're asking it. It's sort of drawing conclusions. So many, I'd say most, but I can't say definitively all, AIs will return that strawberry contains 2 R's. But of course, those of us who are great spellers know that it's 3 R's in strawberry. But you can have this argument with this AI, and you're saying, well, it's, count it out, spell it for me, and it will spell it correctly, but it doesn't recognize there's 3 R's in it. Where I'm going with this is, I think the potential danger is that we see these pieces of technology, these tools, as truly infallible. Are we there yet where we can say how many R's are in strawberry, and I've got this problem, what should I do about it? The temptation, and I speak for myself as well, I'm not saying that I'm any better than this, but the temptation is you take the answer and you go, well, that's it. I'll do that because AI told me to. I worry for learners that are using it, or anyone that's using it, teaching staff that's using it, that it becomes this sort of go-to golden model of, I'll ask it a question, that must be the right answer, because it couldn't possibly be wrong. Computers don't make mistakes.
Yeah.
And I think it's really, when you peel back the layers of that onion, you realize that it's a fantastically complex model. It's very exciting technology, but it doesn't mean it's always right. It can make mistakes. If we're relying on the information it provides us to be without error, then, students could certainly get caught out. They won't get the perfect answer if that's what they're planning on using it for.
Yeah, and I think that opens the point about how these tools are designed, and particularly how the UI is designed that sits in front of them, around trying to make sure that the person is in control, the person has got the final decision, the person is leading the AI and not the other way around, which is why I was saying earlier on in the conversation, it's better to ask it, have I justified this well or badly, rather than what's the right answer and what's the wrong answer. We spent a bit of time at NCFE building a kind of generative AI exam builder. And on reflection, I think one of the things we could have done better is rather than trying to build an exam as quick as possible, leaning all of these brilliant technology, like you say, all these great language models that can produce really plausible sounding questions and answers and mark schemes, we should have maybe spent a bit longer thinking, okay, how do we insert the person back in to this? And it might not take 5 minutes, it might take 15 minutes, but actually that's a good thing, because we want the person to be in charge, to have that kind of agency over the process that we're supporting with, rather than replacing or automating out a human mind, if you like, in that particular job. So but that was a really exciting project, though, the assistant that we built. We essentially, even before, ChatGPT was widely known, we were working on this idea that we could really help our exam writers write questions, write them with, whether it's adding more consistency and quality or support for their kind of decision making as they write, or whether it's adding more efficiency to say, okay, we've got a question, let's produce a mark scheme for it, or we've got this idea, let's produce a set of questions around the idea. So that was a really exciting project, and we can now produce a maths exam in 5 minutes. However, we have to be honest, it's not anything like a maths exam that a person would produce if they did their job. Now, they might take more than 5 minutes, of course, but if we asked one of our specialist exam writers to produce an exam, they would 100% do a better job. So now we've got to work out, okay, well, which bits do we want to retain out of that thing that we built, and which, so that we're supporting the person to do their job faster, better, more consistently, which bits we want to keep and which bits haven't worked out.
Introducing Cash Alumni Plus membership, your passport to exclusive features and professional development opportunities. You can now choose to elevate your membership experience and enjoy a host of enhanced benefits, including a brand new comprehensive library of e-learning modules and cashback discounts worth up to an average of £329 in savings per year. Expand your circle, exchange ideas, and stay ahead of industry developments with access to networking events both online and in person. Plus, with access to employment and career guidance sessions, you can confidently navigate your career path with personalized advice and job opportunities tailored just for you. Upgrade to Cash Alumni Plus membership for only £25 per year to access all these features and more. Head over to your member homepage or use the Join Us link in the show notes for this episode to find out more.
I heard a story from, I can't remember which school it was, but essentially the teacher decided to take a set of questions that she intended to give her students and have AI produce the answers. She then removed the bulk of the paragraph, and so it was only the sort of preceding 3 to 6 words. Things like, I think I know, I think it's green because, and then the next paragraph was, I think 2 + 2 is 4 because, and it was just that essentially became a skeleton. And what was really interesting was the student response, because it was, I guess, part of an experiment, and the student response, or incidentally, I should clarify, the students performed better in this new model of assessment than they had previously. When asked the students, they said, what did you think? And they all hated it. What did you hate about it? And they go, because you'd structured my answer with the first X number of words, you gave me no freedom to answer the question how I would normally. And so I was forced to think about the question in the way that you'd phrased it. So where I'm going with this is really, what was really interesting is the students that previously maybe would have given a one-word answer instead of a paragraph, the question was phrased in a sort of answer this, and they had to give a paragraph answer. So this is perhaps something that students are maybe missing out around those verb descriptors. So we say describe, but they're giving us the equivalent of an identifier. So they're giving one word where we need a paragraph. And so there's not enough meat on the bones. So this model that this teacher had perhaps accidentally created forced the student, and that's what they really hated about it. Because they said, you forced me to answer the question in a certain way, which I thought was really interesting, because as an AO, you kind of go, that's exactly what we want to see, but we don't want the students to be unhappy about it. But again, it's this sort of template, this skeleton, that I think it sounds like what you're describing with the assessment creation here is it's not going to be a replacement, or maybe not yet. But if you can give the exam creator this template, this skeleton, and say, well, this is what we've come up with. Could you make this better? Then suddenly maybe it doesn't take 12 months. Maybe it takes 6 months from end to end or something. So there's an improvement in time. But I think there's an efficiency and certainly a quality element that, this is why it takes us so long to do something, because we want to get it right and we want to make sure it's really good.
Sure.
The use of the AI to sort of where efficiency is concerned, it's something we've touched on. We don't necessarily use this in live assessments, but we've played with it as a model, particularly around data sets. So for some of the digital data quals, we require data sets. And there's a variety of ways we can get this. We can take it from the Office of National Statistics, and we can anonymize the data. We can do really cool things with it. But we wanted to see if there was a model where we could generate data sets. Now, if you were when we use data sets, particularly in data quality, you're looking at probably something, right, 50,000 rows. It needs to have enough, there's got to be some oomph to it. There's no point presenting a table of 7 rows to a student. It needs to have more. It obviously takes a long time. If you were to ever actually theoretically sit there and just create it yourself, apart from the fact it would be ridiculous, because you couldn't ever generate a true data set of 50,000 rows, because it would be too much repetition. Your brain's not going to be able to cope with that. But the ability to put it into an AI, a generative AI, to fictionalize, if that's the word, to create and make sure it's not accidentally using someone's actual data, was a really interesting thing to see from an evolution of prompt again, because we could say, give us 50,000 rows that includes made up names, phone numbers, etc. And then we found out that actually the format of the telephone number was in American format. So we said, okay, we'll do it again, but use a British format of telephone numbers. And then sort of kept evolving through and developing this quite rich prompt that ends, being a few paragraphs potentially. But ultimately it gave us something that was potentially useful, or again, to muck back to the assessment, perhaps a starting point. But it's scarily quick. And it sort of links back to, again, what we were talking about before about the sourcing of data. And you think, if we accept that it can't ever be created, so it hasn't made it up, it sourced it from somewhere, and you kind of think, where's that ethical line drawn? Now, it probably is jumbled up enough that we kind of think, we can make the assumption. I think it's a reasonable assumption probably to make that the name doesn't actually match the phone number, doesn't actually match the whatever else, and that could easily be tested. But there's an ethical consideration in there that once you've put information out there onto the internet or into an AI, potentially that information could resurface. We know that ourselves from an AO's perspective. If we're testing things with a question, we have to be really careful to make sure that question doesn't actually resurface at some point down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that's what's holding some people back here, is that security concern, because a lot of our work does need to stay so secure so that there is no kind of leaks or breaches of questions or papers and things. But that's definitely something that's holding us back at the moment, is how do we get over that hurdle and give people access to something that we can say is completely secure. Go right ahead and collaborate with this tool as much as you like, because nothing's going to go anywhere. But we can't say that for sure at the moment. We know we can't say that. So we're just trying to quietly solve that problem in the background right now, actually, by building our own or downloading and hosting locally our own LLM. But that's in a really early stage of work. And we're just trying to see, basically, does it work and how good is it, rather than anything further at the moment.
That's a really interesting thing, actually. Perhaps that's worth exploring for people who want to essentially do it for themselves. For those who are listening, hopefully we've excited them into the use of AI. What options do they have, essentially? So you're describing the use of a large language model. So that's in essence sort of the database, the brain, or the knowledge of it. I'm interested. How do we? I mean, you've talked about security, but are there any other considerations that we applied to arrive at that conclusion as might be the right one for us?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, as you would imagine, there's quite a lot of decisions to make before you get anywhere near having a tool to use. I would probably start by looking at Meta's Llama 3 model, which is the most known open source LLM. And because it's open source, you can essentially grab yourself a copy, put it in your own cloud space, and then it becomes yours to do what you like with. So if you imagine, if I go onto my ChatGPT, everything I put in will somehow end up very quickly in America to get processed and come back. And am I going to make a call, if you like, out to that service wherever it's hosted in the world? Whereas with an open source LLM that you download, the call, if you like, only stays within your cloud. So you're asking the LLM, which is essentially right next to you rather than over the other side of the world. So that's a place to start, is look at Llama 3. But actually, as soon as you start to look into it, there's quite a lot of open source LLMs available. So then you sort of start to have to, the first decision is, okay, well, which is the best one? And obviously it comes back to, we talked about before, well, what are you using it for? What's its main characteristics? This will be coming out of its training data, and people have kind of measured those different characteristics and provided comparisons. So that's the first question. And then the second big question is, well, how do I interact with it? And what kind of interface do I want, or user interface do I want? So we've very simply pulled an open source UI off the web, just to stand in front of this local large language model, so that, you know, it essentially looks a bit like ChatGPT. You know, there's a box that you ask a question, and your prompt can be quite big. And as we've alluded to, you kind of developed your prompt over time. So it gets, as you converse with your AI, you realize you forgot to tell it something quite important, like, I'm in England, not America, by the way. And then that becomes part of your prompt, doesn't it, from then on? Our interface just has a box that says, what do you want to know? And you can start conversing. So that's kind of where we're at the moment. We've just grabbed these 2-3 things, put them together, hosted them locally. There is obviously some cloud computing costs, but it's very, very small compared to, say, you know, $25 a month for ChatGPT 4.0 or $30 a month for Copilot 365 or whatever. So we're talking about much lower cost. The next phase of this work is now to figure out, okay, we've got a local LLM, we've got a user interface. What's the best way to use it? And that obviously comes back down to the prompts. So we're just now starting to think about the prompts. And then once we've got that question kind of answered, we'll need to think about the outputs and measuring those. And sorry, there is one important thing I forgot to mention, which is creating our own internal document library to guide this local LLM for NCFE stuff rather than generic stuff. So that's another step that we need to undertake next, which is what's the best set of documents that we can provide this LLM to give us the best quality outputs. So for example, we're going to give this to some colleagues that write assessments, and we're going to give it some exemplar assessments and say, these are our best ones. These are the style, the sort of language that we want to use, and try and replicate that, but in a different subject or a different scenario or whatever the thing that we're changing. So we've done the first 2 bits, the open source bits, that's working great. And now we need to sort of do all that refinement work almost. You know, what's the document library we want to call on? What's the right way of prompting it? And that's the next sort of setup phase. And then the last phase is, okay, let's test the output, see what kind of things we're getting. No question, that will lead us to more refinements, but that's sort of that to and fro process is what we're going to be undertaking over the next month or so.
Fantastic. And that's all ring fenced. So we to all intents and purposes, host that LMM ourselves. I appreciate you saying it's in the cloud, but it's not publicly available. So that addresses the security concern.
Yes.
And we're building that out ourselves.
Yes.
So
So yeah, you're right. It 100% addresses the security concerns because nothing goes anywhere. And actually, we figured even when you've got sort of various settings on some of those off-the-shelf LLMs where we can stop your data ending up in the training data for the model. So you've almost like trying to deal with those security concerns there. But actually, if you look further, everything is still processed somewhere, and that often isn't the UK. So that's still that data is still going out somewhere, even if it's never being stored. So that's a worry. So by hosting it locally, you remove that as an issue because your data doesn't leave your own part of the cloud, and it never becomes part of anyone's training model because it's downloaded. And you will, of course, need to refresh the LLM that you've downloaded. You'll need to kind of keep it up to date because it will be evolving, whether you're using Llama 3 or a different one. I can't remember your question, but I was answering a question that the data doesn't go anywhere.
Does that address the security concern? And then the following question essentially is, without perhaps sharing anything that may be too early to share, are there other concerns sharing some information, sharing some insight for those listening that might want to do this themselves? Because we've essentially chosen to take an existing LLM and then train it ourselves, but ring fence it so we can address the security concerns we have. If those want to do it themselves, have the same concerns, they can mimic the same kind of thing. But there are other options, and I'm just wondering if we explored those and dismissed them, because like I said, we've chosen to do it ourselves, but you could buy in, you can build it yourself. What else did we explore? What other options are available for those wanting to do it themselves?
Okay, so I was explaining before about the exam writing assistant tool we built. That was a complete build. We built that in conjunction with a tech partner from scratch, essentially. The open source models that you download, we describe them as DIY. So that's basically doing it ourselves. Somewhere at the other end of the scale where we're doing everything ourselves and we control it. And then in the middle, you've got this kind of ability to buy a tool, probably as a SaaS subscription where you just pay your monthly access, pay for your colleagues to access or whatever. Now, if you are, what we've come to a position on is, if you're trying to sort of help a person with their productivity, with their quality, with their day-to-day work, then actually building is not the right option for you. It's a really big infrastructure project. It takes a lot of investment, a lot of time to get right. So save those builds for the big stuff where maybe you want to change how you work, change the products that you offer as an organization, like change something big, about how you do it. If you're trying to improve a current workflow, then you want to go with the buy or DIY options. And then it comes down to some of these considerations that we're talking about. Security is definitely one. Cost is obviously another. Processing power is another. But for example, our DIY option is currently pretty slow because we're only giving it a little bit of processing power. If we turn the dial up on that, then ups the cost. So you have to sort of find the compromise. And I think you mentioned it earlier, you will definitely find that there are tools out there that you can buy that have this kind of narrow use case because that organization has perfected the use of AI for that particular thing. So Grammarly is a really good example here, I think, from what you were saying. And there'll be plenty of others. So really, there's not much point doing all that work that somebody's already done, sharing all that cost amongst all its users rather than just maybe your organization, and getting a relatively cheap access to something that is really, really good because somebody spent time and effort doing all the tinkering, the remedial work to get those outputs really, really, really top notch. So that's the kind of the consideration. There is one other really important thing to think about for both buy and DIY is what is your training data that you give it. So bear in mind that both of these options, the language will come from the large language model. So that's already pre-trained. So that the ability to produce plausible language is what you're buying in essentially, or what you're downloading. But what you might want to do is add some of your local knowledge, your local style, your local, inside your organization elements to get that output how you want it. So for example, how NCFE wants it. And so that training library is really important. The bigger, the better, essentially. So the more examples you can give it, the more context you can give it, the more instructions you can give it. So say, for example, we have some writing guidance for a particular subject, then we definitely want to give that to our AI because it will help it write an item how we want it. But there is a caveat on that, because if you open up the AI to say a portion of your SharePoint, for example, if I say, right, I want all of assessment solutions, I want access to everything that they do, so I want to train my AI for it to know everything, then you have to remember that quite a lot of that data and quite a lot of those files are going to be out of date. Really bad at going back and deleting stuff that we don't want anymore. We just kind of forget about it and we make a new file or make a new version. And so all those old versions are there, all the old ways of working, maybe all the old templates, the old styles that we've kind of moved on from and, we've improved on over time are going to be there. And so this is a really key consideration if you get Copilot 365, for example. On the face of it, that sounds like a great tool because it interacts with all your apps and it interacts with all of your SharePoint. Just the SharePoint that you can see, by the way. So you should be controlling access to sensitive data because my Copilot 365 could only see my bit of SharePoint and anything I'd be given access to. The problem is that relatively small bit of SharePoint is actually really big and full of old stuff. So before I do that, I then need to go and do a proper audit of all of my files in SharePoint and say, okay, those are the ones I don't want. I want to delete. I want to kind of prune here because I don't want my AI getting confused when it says, okay, well, here's a style of a question. Here's a completely different style of a question. You need to be really careful about how you curate a really good, big as you can, but really high quality data library for your AI to call on when it's responding to your prompt.
Yeah, it's that double-edged sword, isn't it? That, like you say, the more information, the better. But you've got to have some control over what you're putting in. It's, I suppose, to use all technology time, it's garbage in, garbage out. Not that I'm saying our stuff is garbage. if we don't give it some control, if we don't exercise some control and we just give it unfettered access, then of course, some of that is addressed by, SOPs, I suppose, to a certain extent. We just need to be, and we need to sort of say if something's retired, then it needs to be moved to an archive. There's really good reasons why we might want to keep it, but we don't keep it in the area that we're going to use for training. Do we cover everything that I think people need to know? I think that covers all the options, doesn't it?
I was wanting to ask you about learners using AI in assessment, because that's a bit of a hot topic for us, isn't it? And I wondered what you thought that kind of looks like in the future and how we might end up in a place where learners can and do use generative AI as part of their assessed work with us, or whether that's always going to kind of be, we don't really want to open that Pandora's box.
So, this is my opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of NCFE in this concept. I see AI as a tool, and I think that's the most useful way to think of it and use it in assessment or outside. So if we were to go back a few, then, if we take a look in the subject of mathematics and the advent of calculators, did calculators make mathematics easier? Well, there's a couple of different arguments. You can certainly do multiplication a lot faster, probably, on a calculator than you can in your head. If you were to give me a scientific calculator and to tell me to work out, and apologies if this is not technically accurate, and I suspect it won't be, but the cosine of the tangent of a acute angled triangle, if any of that makes sense, then I would sort of say, well, I don't know how to do it. And if your argument is, but you do know how to do it because you've got a scientific calculator in front of you and that can absolutely do what I've asked you to do, then my response is still going to be, but I don't know which buttons to press. I don't know how to do it. I don't really understand what you're asking me. And so I'm going to take a guess. Is it blue? And you say, no, that's not an accurate answer. Okay, fine. So I've got all the tools. So why couldn't I do it? And I think it's a similar thing with AI. Can AI generate something, if we're talking about AI in this case? So you ask a student to do something, and okay, AI can create something. But unless you understand the prompt, then you don't know which buttons on that particular calculator to press. So you're not going to come up with an accurate answer. But if we take a step back and look at it from that higher level perspective, what did we do in mathematics when calculators were invented? How did we address that? Now, I can't speak from personal experience because I wasn't there, but I imagine at first everyone said no calculators and exams. And then gradually it's evolved. And in essence, we basically made the assessments for mathematics a little bit harder to allow for the fact that students were using calculators. So we said, well, they've got this tool, so let's test a different element of it. Let's not test their ability to press a button, but to understand answers. And that's really what we're supposed to be assessing in essence anyway. The fact that a calculator can do it. Do we really care that a student can divide 1 million by 6.9 and et cetera, et cetera. It's not important. They need to understand the component parts of it. Well, it's the same thing in digital. It's the same thing in science. At the same time, in anything, if they've got a tool that gives them an efficiency gain, but they still understand that component parts, then I'm still super happy about that. So should we be seeing students at the moment copy and pasting an extended response question, an ERQ from their assessment into a generative AI, copy and pasting the answer back into an assessment paper and submitting it? No, we absolutely shouldn't. Clearly, that's not right. It's not testing anything. So we need to change our assessment. And when I say our, I really don't mean our NCFE. I mean the education sector. We need to respond to what AI is presenting us as an opportunity and say, well, we need to change how we assess that. Then we can't just, test it in the same way. We can't assess in the same way. So I accept, linking it back to your earlier comment of being biased. I absolutely am. But this is essentially the sector I come from. And so, yes, I do think it's a great tool, potentially. I don't think we're quite there yet. And so clearly, like I say, we're not suggesting anyone should be able to copy and paste answers. That's not really testing anything. It's pointless. But if we see it's going to be there anyway, then we can say, okay, so how do we control its use? How do we ensure that the underlying learning outcome is actually being tested? And frankly, as an awarding organisation, and I'm speaking for us and potentially for all organisations, if we're simply saying in something like the context of an ERQ that if they contain these 3 keywords, then they get all full marks, then we're not doing our jobs properly. Mm-hmm. We've got to have a richer experience than that. So I think what we'll see over the next few years is an evolution, a response to that, where we can then say, we know it's going to be there. Let's allow it to be there, but change our assessment model. And the same thing could be applied to something like Grammarly. Do we award additional marks for quality of written content? Yes. Should that be allowed if they're using Grammarly, etc.? We just got to be responsive to it and make sure that we're testing the underlying knowledge. If that needs to change our assessment model, so the same model applies, in my opinion, I think we've got a lot of conversation to have in the sector before we're quite there.
This is Podcash, brought to you by Cash Alumni. For job search and careers advice in care, health and education, why not try our state-of-the-art Skills Miner AI tool? Skills Miner is under the Careers tab of cashalumni.org.uk. That's cashalumni.org.uk.
We don't know yet what the new AI-assisted level should be. What's the expectation? So that's one thing that we need to find out before we do much more. It's the equivalent of how much harder did maths get when the calculator came in. So what's that change? We don't know. And then the other thing it throws up is that if learners are using AI on a knowledge-based learning outcome, then we've done something wrong with our assessment. We need to look at our assessment design, because we shouldn't really be asking learners to do an internal piece of coursework, say, or a timed external assessment just on knowledge, because generative AI is really good at answering that. We're just about to publish a report from the Open University, which our Assessment Innovation Fund paid for, around how good is Gen AI at answering these questions. And of the 59 questions that they studied, 58 got a pass mark. The Gen AI got a pass mark. And in most of those 58, it did actually quite well. So then it sort of throws up, well, how do we change our assessment design to lower the vulnerability, I guess, of those assessment types? And definitely knowledge should now be something that we shouldn't just be asking some baseline knowledge on an internal assessment. We should change the design of, okay, that might need to be a professional discussion or Viva type thing. It might need to be a presentation, and we need a different mode, if you like, of assessment. Or we need to push that bit of assessment into a secure exam, where we know that, for example, with a calculator or the Gen AI isn't in use. Mm-hmm. We've got a really interesting example on our website of when a student might be able to use AI in their work. And the example is a student's creating a video for their work, and they want to edit the video so it's a better version of it. And so the student goes away, uses Gen AI for ideas about how to edit video, to develop the student's thinking about, these are things I could do to make my video better. And then, of course, the student has to apply that to their video. So they actually have to take the information from the AI, put it into practice, do it, and produce their video at the end. And so the learning outcome is about producing the video. The student's done a really good job, in my opinion, of using AI to help them produce the video, but the AI hasn't done it. The student's still done it. So it comes down to the learning outcome. Are you able to show, as a learner, to provide evidence towards that learning outcome, even though you're using Gen AI for some of that work? Then often the answer is yes, but sometimes the answer is no. So then it becomes our job, people that set internal assessments in our centres, job to get the assessment design right for that particular learning outcome. And that's how we currently sort of solve the problem. And your point about Gen AI enabled answers in the future, akin to the calculator, that's then something that we can work on in the sort of medium term.
Yeah, no, I love that. And of course, we also have to, at some point, we, society, have to address the fact that we already talked about a couple of times, is that AI is not always right. So you can't just do it. Maybe that should just be a standard question that we ask in all assessments going forward. How many R's in strawberry? And just that's the simplest test. But I do worry, and again, this is absolutely coming from a biased position of being very pro technology, but I worry sometimes that as a society and as an education sector, we're spending so much effort and time on trying to figure out how to spot people using AI as kind of a sort of a plagiarism element, and perhaps not enough time and effort trying to figure out how AI should be used, because it's not going away. Calculus didn't go away. Computers didn't go away. So I love your example of if we're trying to test the student's ability to edit a video, what's the harm in getting the ideas from an AI, as long as they're doing the skill, because that's what we're trying to assess. And if we go the other way and apply that to our life, then every time I need to do anything in my house, from plumbing to rewiring or something, I'm not allowed to use a YouTube video to give me the input. I just have to figure it out. Like, that's not the test that we're trying to do. Like, I can take the input, but if I want to do it myself, then I need to execute that knowledge. And so if AI is seen as that input, then you kind of go, right, then we change our mindset. You go, well, it's not cheating, it's not plagiarism, as long as the assessment model changes to allow for its existence. At the moment, we take quite an abstinent view, and we kind of say, well, AI absolutely shouldn't be allowed. Therefore, we should focus all our efforts on spotting when it has been. And I worry that that's a knee-jerk reaction, because it's going to be there. And we're just sort of creating a scenario where people have to sneak it in. Instead, we acknowledge that these shortcuts, or efficiency gains, probably more accurate, are going to be there. And there's a sort of a bit of a joke within the programming world that it's 3% knowledge and 97% copy and pasting. Because if you want to know how to do something, you're not going to sit there and probably figure it out. You're going to go look at a GitHub and see if someone's done something before. But you've got to understand how to bring it together, how to execute it. So if we then say, well, have you brought it together well? Then we go, right, that's what we should be testing, not the fact that because you didn't know how to write this code, because you didn't know how to do this thing. The real skill that I'd love to see is for a student to identify, well, actually, I asked AI, this is how I came to my answer. It told me this, but actually, I know that this is better. And you go, now you've demonstrated that skill. That's really great to see. You've used all the tools available to you, but you come out with a better answer. Great. That's where the mark should be awarded, in my opinion.
And to add some weight to your suggestion that we should probably stop looking at detection and move on and to other more mature ways of thinking about it. The same piece of research that was done by the Open University as a secondary measure, they wanted to know if they could train their markers to spot generative AI use. And obviously I had this great library of answers that they knew students had written and answers that they knew generative AI had written. And so they had a really good basis for doing this. And a really interesting learning point, which I wouldn't have even thought of before the research, was that when they train their assessors how to spot generative AI, the number of false positives, i.e. learners wrongly accused of using it, went up in nearly every single marker. And so the markers were given this kind of overconfidence in spotting generative AI, and they were actually applying it to things that learners do, and probably potentially those lower level learners who are being a bit less creative, should we say, with their responses. So that was a really unexpected outcome, but it's really interesting, and that maybe shows that we should move on from detection and more to getting the best use, being transparent about it, and getting to the point where we've got an understanding of what's the new level of expectation, and how can we use Gen AI to produce an authentic assessment, because we are all using this stuff in our lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I would love to see. And when I say we, just to be clear, I'm not necessarily saying NCFE. I just mean we as the education sector. But I would, I do feel, again, slightly biased, but I feel like NCFE is blazing a trail here with things like the Assessment and Innovation Fund. You've mentioned Open University research that AIF funded. We've also seen some other really cool projects that are quite literally at the bleeding edge of assessment that AIF has funded that frankly just would never have come to fruition, would never have even been conceptualized were it not for things like that. So it's exciting to be here at NCFE and seeing those new ideas coming through, but both as suggestions, but also where the AIF fund has been able to literally fund them. It's really cool seeing some of those ideas. And I get way too excited seeing some of these things where you just think that's such a good idea, absolutely brilliant idea, and we never would have thought about it. And so we can then sort of move it through and get the funding there. And then, they don't always necessarily go the full run, but some of them that have coming through are super exciting, and I think genuinely will change the face of education. So that's been really cool to see, 100%.
Fantastic. Well, yes, and you can see all those pilots on our website. If you look at the AIF pages, there's details of all of them, and all the reports are public. So yeah, definitely a signpost to something you can do if you've enjoyed listening to this chat. And I think that's where we'll stop, James, for today. Thanks so much for your time and your thoughts. It's been a really interesting kind of amble through generative AI and assessment, and AI approaches.
Thanks for listening to Podcash. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe on your podcast app so you never miss an episode. You can also watch many of these conversations by heading over to cashalumni.org.uk and going to the CPD and best practice section of the site. That's cashalumni.org.uk.